Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good. It's nice to have you on. I know we met like super briefly at the Texas
Really
Blockchain
briefly.
Council thing. Yeah. Um, it's really great to have you on. I've been dying to talk to you. I've been following you for a while and I'm kind of like, yeah, this is going to be an interesting one.
Yes, and let me ask you because sometimes I forget to ask. How do you feel about cursing?
You asked me this at the Texas Blockchain thing.
I
It's
know,
fine.
I know. Okay, okay.
It's
I
totally
always
fine.
do it right before we go live because, and I probably told you this then, if I don't ask, I'll go to rant about something and then my brain short circuits thinking, should I say this? Should I reword this? And then I'm like, so.
And then people are frustrated because they have to spend 3 hours editing it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I don't want to, start. I have cursed a couple times and I've seen someone's face go like shit, I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, I don't mind not. I just have to prepare ahead of time to like go all in or sort of be more careful. So
It's so funny actually because I was listening to that podcast you did with the Bitcoin veterans where you were saying that you might be over
yeah.
40, and I thought that was hilarious because I was like, God, she's got such a baby face.
I am over 40. Um
But
and
it's interesting,
yes,
you do actually look about 25, seriously,
I
even
know.
in real life. Mm. So I was listening to your podcast with the Bitcoin veterans to prepare for this.
Yes.
Hilarious. Although I was like, are they going to get to the point? It's like 20 minutes of like chit chatting. And then I was like, finally, we get the intro. So note, Gabe, like get to the point.
I love them. They're so great.
Yeah, they're so nice. But do you want to just give a brief introduction of who you are? Because like one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is that your background is just unbelievably interesting. Not just in the Bitcoin context, but also in the context of like it's very topical of what's going on right now.
Yeah,
Um, in a kind of geopolitical sphere. So do you want to just kind of give a rundown of like who you are and what your background is?
sure. Yeah, so I have a background in computer science, which always comes as a surprise to people. And I
Girl.
spent, I know, women in STEM, yes, before it was a thing. Um, but I spent 12 years in DC, working in like different tech
Sorry, hold
startups
on one
and
second. I've
yeah.
got a neighbor who's decided to do their lawn. I just need to shut the window. Hold on one sec.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Right, I'm gonna have to cut that one out as well now.
Okay, then I don't feel bad. You'll have to do a little bit of editing, not just for me. So,
Right.
um,
Yeah. So
you
would
know
you
what
like
you
to tell
could
us?
do if you oh, I'm sorry. Now you're gonna have to cut this out, but you could leave your question in, and then you could pull that segment out, and I'll send you like a thumbs up in a few, and like it might be a couple months. Then you can like send that clip out, and we'll get some publicity.
Oh,
But
you mean the first one? Yes, yes, yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
But
So
yes, back to who you
okay,
are. It's fine. I'll
right.
probably leave it in anyway. I don't care. I mean, like my
Okay.
friend was saying to me the other day, she's like, I love how like what a mess your podcast is. There's like dogs barking.
I just tweeted about this. People are desperate for authenticity, So it's true. Like, let it be, like things happen.
Yeah, so noisy
Okay.
noisy neighbor has been eradicated now. But yes, you were telling me about your background, or you were telling us
Okay.
about your background.
Yes. So I'm an Uber nerd. I have a background in computer science. And I was in DC for almost 12 years. I went to school there and then I worked for a number of tech startups. And so I learned a lot. There's lots of hot rumors that I'm a Fed and all these funny things, but I did, you learn a lot of stuff being in DC and working in tech. Everything is really like adjacent to the intelligence communities. And that was something that was like really developing as I was going through my career. And I didn't like it, but I did learn a lot. I think that informs a lot of my like viewpoints and analysis now. Um, but I didn't want to be involved in politics. I hated being there ultimately, and I fled. I refused to move to San Francisco, which is kind of what you did if you worked in tech. And so somehow I ended up in Dubai. I started traveling and I wanted to go to Asia. I wanted to go to places that were like really foreign, not just, France and Europe, Mexico. So I ended up over there and worked for a startup incubator. And while I was there, I got recruited to work in foreign direct investment, which is generally where my kind of like Bitcoin story starts. I only spent about 2 years working in FDI, and it's this strange little niche um, ecosystem that surrounds the World Economic Forum. And what FDI is it's just economic development at like the highest level. So it's like country level investment from one foreign nation to another or from these really large multinational entities. And that was the time that I spent, really, really in like the belly of the beast. I thought that I'd fled it leaving DC, but I sort of ironically ended up deeper in it. Um, and that gave me access to things that you just could never imagine seeing or experiencing. And I was just kind of like a fly on the wall, observing all of this stuff. And it sort of shattered everything that I thought that I knew, that I thought that I wanted. And I burnt out in flames from that. It was extremely stressful. I ended up, super sick and just kind of literally like burning out in flames, and came back to the States in 2018. And I got kind of further radicalized upon return because of the world that I came back to, you know. And so from 2018 to like really probably 2022, like for a few years, I just kind of like laid low, and I was trying to talk to people in my life about like what I'd seen, what I felt like was going on. I felt like everything here was really radical. Like you couldn't, discuss the current president. And I came back and was like, oh, you don't like what you're seeing. That's okay, but can we talk about why? Like I've been out of the country. I'm unclear. And no one would speak to me. I mean, that's sort of its own entire conversation. But so I ended up back here and I moved to Florida. I was just kind of like laying low and trying to accept that no one cared about what I'd seen or what I'd been through. And then COVID happened, lo and behold. And so for me, the silver lining for COVID was that people started coming back to me and saying, "Wait a second, what have you been saying? Like, hold on, you think you were comparing the U.S. to China, and I thought you were crazy, but like now we're doing lockdowns the same way that China did." And so that kind of opened up an opportunity for me to go public again, and it took a little bit of time to kind of work up the courage to be like fully honest about everything that I'd seen. Um, and Bitcoiners really inspired me to do that. I started to go to conferences and events and meet more Bitcoiners in real life and see, I found this whole group of people, a whole community, a whole gang of folks that I knew had seen similar things, were open to what I had seen, wanted to hear the things that I saw. So at some point I doxed myself on Twitter and kind of started to tell the stories and talk just really openly and honestly. I always knew that if I was going to kind of blow the whistle on the stuff that I saw, that I'd have to do it like the whole way. Like you can't just talk about it a little bit. There's just not that much credibility in it. I tell these long stories now, and they're complex and they're nuanced, and I retell them and I'm like, if I hadn't lived through that, like I would find that really, like I find it hard to believe, and I did live through it, you know.
Yeah.
So I started that journey about 2 years ago, and like tweeting and just talking openly. And that's been an incredible experience. So now I have, the opportunity to talk regularly about corruption and the things that I saw. And I also started working in Bitcoin. So I do product development now for one of the Bitcoin ATM companies. And it's awesome. I'm super grateful, and I can't believe it's my real life. I love it.
That's amazing. So, can you talk a little bit about then, like what you saw in foreign direct investment? Because I know that Alex Gladstein has written a lot about that as well. About like he has a whole book and an article in Bitcoin Magazine about the issues with the IMF and the World Bank. So, the entity that you were working in, was it working with those organizations or was it separate to that? And how was it involved with the World Economic Forum?
Sure. It was separate. So I actually just worked for like a really small consulting company. And there are a lot of them. They're all sort of nameless and faceless. And they facilitate a lot of the going ons that happen by doing, supporting services. So, like research and analysis, statistics. If you've ever taken a statistics class, you understand how, like, numbers can be manipulated very easily. And so one entity might come and say, here's what we'd like to do. Can you provide the evidence that this is the right thing to do? A lot of people believe that it works the other way around, where there's like these good faith studies to look at something and then make a decision. But generally, it's a decision is made and they kind of backfill the support for it. So I worked for a
Wow.
consulting company that did those types of things. It's really like a pay to play thing. And, um, so when I went to work for them, I actually had never really, I didn't know anything about the World Economic Forum before I accepted that job. And then all of a sudden I was surrounded by people talking about it all the time, and like their whole life goal was to make it to Davos. And so I did like a deep dive into like, well, what is the WEF? Like I didn't even know. Um and we actually, I attended, I think for 3 years I went to I believe it's called the World Forum for Foreign Direct Investment. It's kind of like the C or D level. Like if you can't make it to Davos, it's like if you're a B list or a C list celebrity in economics, you get to go to this event. And I will say, that's where I met Peter Zine. I met him several. He was always there. I met him several times, and so I've got some, you know.
So, would you consider him D-list?
Well, I would consider his information like,
Poor Peter, if
I
he's
try to
listening.
yeah, yeah, I actually like genuinely try to run proper counter propaganda to anything he says, because it drives me crazy, the credibility that people like him are given. And they
Mm.
are given the credibility because they're willing to participate in this web of lies. Um, he gets these ideas or the goals from above, and then he kind of backfills presentations and books and talking points and provides the supporting evidence to what the ultimate goal was.
So I'm
And I
curious
just
just to
yeah.
unpick that then. I mean, um, do you think, because one of the comments that Alex Gladstein made about like the IMF and the World Bank, and he sort of said in a podcast, he said to be charitable, probably a lot of people in those organizations don't realize what they're actually partaking in. So they think that they're working towards something good. But he was sort of saying, when you look at the outcomes of those organizations, it's you can't dispute the fact that they're actually causing great harm to many, many nations across the world. Do you think that the majority of the people that participate in that system are aware? So when you're saying that sort of economists and statisticians are getting requests to produce data, at what point do you think they become aware, if ever, that what they're
Sure.
actually doing is just kind of supporting an agenda that has nothing to do with like doing good, let's say?
Sure. Yeah, I would largely agree with that opinion, especially with the larger organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. The bigger the organization, the more people there are who are sort of middle managers and paper pushers, and they maybe aren't privy to the meetings at the top. One of the things I think that I ultimately benefited from was the fact that I did get sort of scooped up by one of these really small consulting companies. We probably had like 50 employees or less, and I had a pretty significant role there. So I was in those meetings, that you would like the high level meetings. But of course, I don't know how many people like the World Bank or the IMF employees. I knew a lot of people. I'm not going to say a lot, but I knew a handful of people in while I was in DC that worked for these organizations, and they were good people, young and eager to do good things. So I think you do largely have people who get swept up in the idea of thinking that they do good. And you're just caught up in this a system, really. And there's counter incentives to, you know, you're not incentivized to ask any questions. Even
Mm.
if you are at the bottom and you're a lowly little, number cruncher or something, and you step back and you maybe find someone's book like Gladstein, or, someone running their mouth like me, and you start to think more like so you think about it and you look at it and you're like, oh shit, like there seems to be some merit to this. Like, are we really doing this? I mean, what do you do, right? Like, so I gave a presentation in Prague and I made a joke about like the corruption doesn't start on day one. It creeps in and it grows and it works its way up. And even once you do realize that you're surrounded by corruption or that you're maybe not facilitating great things, then what? Like, there's no hotline to call. Like, do you call 1-800 corruption and like tell somebody that? Then what happens, right? Like, no, it's laughable because these things don't exist, and we get labeled like conspiracy theorists or crazy people for just being willing to, like, not even willing to speak the truth, but even just questioning, right? So you're some entry level or middle level person who works at the IMF, and all of a sudden you're questioning like the outcomes of the entire organization. I think we all know how that would be received. And it's not received well. So you really have to like make choices all the time. And the choices are like, do I keep my mouth shut or do I keep my job? And that's a hard decision to make, especially when you're younger and you're lower on the totem pole. Even in my role, I was really scared to say, like, you guys, this is all a lie. This is all a fraud. Like, everyone was so proud of me. My parents were really proud of me. I had, friends were like jealous, like, oh, you're traveling all over the world. Like, I had business cards with an important title on them, and you can call it ego, you can call it like whatever it is. It's a complicated thing, but we get caught up in it, right? And so there's so many things that have to be shattered in order to speak the truth. And so even if you're, a good person and you realize that you're not necessarily doing good things, like, then what? What do you do? I think that's the hard thing is there's not a lot of other options right now. And so this is one of the things about Bitcoin that gives me so much hope is I think, we're building parallel systems, and the more success we have in that, the more options that there will be. So for maybe say some young number cruncher at the IMF who realizes, "Oh shit, I don't want to be a part of this." Well, let's all as Bitcoiners run awesome companies, and then we can employ the good people. And slowly by slowly, I see that hopefully taking over the world.
Where do you think the corruption comes from? Like, do you think it's just it gets built into the system because of the way that the system works, or do you think that there is a specific kind of top-down agenda? And what's the objective of the corruption at the end of the day? I mean, obviously individuals in the system have a monetary incentive and, like you said, maybe a status incentive, but the end goal of like doing these corrupt things, like who's benefiting from it and who's ultimately driving it?
Sure. I think it is built in by design, but it's also top down. The same couple thousand people at most. I mean, by some regards, it could be a couple of hundred people are running all of these alphabet organizations. You can go on LinkedIn and kind of like do research within it. I saw this even when I was living in DC. Like, people will hop from one organization to the other, and as you work your way up, the numbers just get smaller. So it's really only a handful of individuals um, who are running all of these global institutions. And it's hard to wrap your mind around that there's really only, a few people, but it's true. Like, and so they're all benefiting profoundly, personally. And I think if there's a monetary incentive and there's also an incentive because these people want power. They believe for the most part that they're really, really good people. And I saw what you see a lot of this like need to reconfirm the belief, probably because they know maybe deep down that they're actually terrible people and what they're doing is terrible. Um, but yeah, it's the
In what
fact.
sense do you mean reconfirm their belief? Like, what do you mean?
Well, they just, they're big on like awards and, there's all these like ceremonies and events and awards that get handed out and just like totally superficial achievements, right? Like they're not actually like down in the dirty with the low income communities or anyone that they're claiming to help looking for like actual success. Like, we helped 300 people who never owned a home before. Well, now they own homes. No, that's not what they're interested in, right? They're interested in $100 million economic grant for, the unhoused development corporation based in, little city Arkansas. And they win the money and everybody gets a massive percent of that money. And then the actual benefit sort of trickles down, but just like the tiniest bit. So they're incentivized by the awards. Like for example, a parallel comparison might be, you know, people for a long time were incentivized to get degrees so that they had the degree, right? It wasn't necessarily about all the information that you might learn
Mm.
over the course of the 4 years. It's just you want to be able to put, I have a graduate degree on my resume, or I have an MBA. And these things they're not achieved. No one's looking to do that so that they're actually learning the things that might be useful in building a business, right? Because if we're being really honest, like how do you best learn those things? Well, you go out and get a job and run a business. You don't sit in a school, siloed in a corner and talk about running businesses. But where has the value been placed? The value has been placed on the actual degree, the photo op where you walk across the stage in your cap and gown, and then you get to put on your resume that you have this title. And so it's about the titles and the superficial, um, super superficial, like, oh, I got invited to this dinner. Okay, well, that's great. But, did you actually like do anything good or meaningful? Or is the dinner itself the thing that you were aiming to
Yeah,
achieve?
it's funny because you do see some of that in the Bitcoin industry. I interviewed somebody like quite a while ago, but she was basically talking about she was in a segment of the Bitcoin industry that I thought was really interesting, and I wanted to talk to her about that. And when I got her on the like interview, she didn't seem to know that much about the industry, but she was very keen to tell me about all of these different organizations that were interested in having her on their advisory boards and things like that. And I was just like, yeah, this is I mean, you do see it in Bitcoin as well. I guess it's just like
Right.
that type of character, but it was very obvious that like the actual the knowledge of that particular field wasn't there.
Mhm.
In
Yeah.
terms of what
Yeah,
she.
I think, there's pros and cons to like the growth of Bitcoin. We have presidential candidates like vying for our attention now. I think Bitcoin's kind of in a new era, but there are certainly uh as something grows, it's not always
Yeah,
how
it
do I
has
say
its.
it nicely? Like, we see some of these fiat things being recreated within Bitcoin, and I think that that was inevitable. But I'm happy to have my friends that have been around, before some of these things started, and it does sort of become really obvious when you meet people and get to
Yeah.
chat with them. So
Yeah, I have to say, I've noticed more in the last year, like some of the grifters. I didn't see it so much before, but I get a lot of people
yeah,
reach out to me for stuff now, and it's like now I'm kind of like, oh yeah, okay, I see that now, where it's not
right.
quite the kind of pure and mission driven thing that
Yeah.
I'd kind of envisioned it was. Can you talk to me a bit about how you actually discovered Bitcoin and then you got into it? Because you're enmeshed in this world, you're seeing the corruption, and then like when did you actually discover the technology and what was your light bulb moment?
Yeah.
orange pill moment, I should say?
Yeah. Well, I had a couple because my first one was really from a technology perspective. So, 2017, I was still working in foreign direct investment, but I was super disillusioned. I had seen the corruption and I was trying to figure out how to get out of it. Like, oh, as I say, like, now what? Like, so I was still, going through the motions and doing my job, and I was at a conference in Cartagena, Colombia. It was a free trade zone conference. So super corrupt nonsense, if you know anything about that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I was like sitting in a corner because I didn't really want to be there. And this Russian kid sat down next to me, and he clearly also did not want to be there. And we got to talking, and he says to me, like, have you heard of cryptocurrency? Like, do you know what Bitcoin is? Do you know what Ethereum is? And I was like, well, I have some friends in DC, like, 2010, 2011. I had a couple friends that were into it. It's like, when's the first time you ignored Bitcoin? And that was when I
Yeah.
ignored Bitcoin. um but I was like super primed in that moment to understand it. And he had friends that were actually working on the development of the Mycelium wallet, which was one of the very first Bitcoin wallets. And so I was just like, I was ready. So I think that was June or July of 2017. And I literally started Googling it. I went back, I set up a Google alert. So literally every time the word Bitcoin was on the internet, I would get an email. And I read all the emails, I read everything. I still get them today. I brag about it every year on Twitter. um, it's like a daily digest now, but at the time, there wasn't so much like attention on Bitcoin, so it wasn't all like propaganda and FUD and
Mm.
like designed media. It was more informative. And I understand because of my background, like I understood the technical piece of it very quickly. And I did spend some time sort of like swing trading on that. Like the fork wars were, playing out, and Ethereum, I forget what was happening with Ethereum, but I saw it and I thought, like, this is, similar to the way that software development works. And I understand that cycle and how that works. And I kind of like placed some bets, and you know, I was totally just trying to like make as much fiat as I could because I wanted to get out of the situation I was in, and I ultimately was able to, which was incredible. Um and then I continued to like trade shit coins a little bit and just hold Bitcoin. But I moved back to the US. And so I would say that was my first, like, my entry point, but I don't know that everything really clicked at that time. It took more, it took more. So I came back to the US. I kind of dealt with everything that I'd been through. Things sort of settled, and I came back to Bitcoin, and this time I started studying really like the macro economic things that we discuss. Like I remember seeing some, all these clips and stuff talking about fiat currency and debasement and inflation and all of that. And I think that that was the missing piece the first time around for me. I didn't have that deep understanding of these topics. So I went really deep on that stuff, and it just all really clicked because of what I experienced, like, geopolitically. It just kind of like all the dominoes lined up. Um and so that was probably that process is what like super super orange pilled me. And then of course COVID and the lockdowns, and I had no disillusions that they were going to lock us down here in the United States. Um, and that actually happening kind of showed me, yes, everything that you think. Maybe not everything, but I came back in 2018 and I thought all this wild stuff. And for a couple years, everyone was like, well, you're just wild. You're crazy. You're a conspiracy theorist. So you kind of start to question yourself, right? But then when they did the lockdowns, I was like, no, like, I'm right. Everything that I think I'm seeing has been confirmed. It's playing out. Um, And so again, like I said, that had brought me back to Bitcoin. I really spent so much more time understanding it really deeply. And so for me, I think that's when I would say I really became like a true Bitcoiner. And then I went to my first Bitcoin conference in 2022, and it was just like no holds bar from then. Like then I was surrounded by people, as crazy as I was. And I don't think I really knew, honestly, because I wasn't on Twitter either. I didn't know how big it was. And it makes me so
Ah,
sad. Like, I wish I'd been around. You guys were sitting around on Clubhouse. I hear all these great stories, like, oh my gosh. But I was really like alone in Bitcoin for a long time, and I knew some people in my life um that served as like really good sources of information for me, but it was just, it was small. It was not like people that are public in any way. Um
mhm.
so yeah, 2022 was my first conference, and that was so exciting for me because like I said, I was surrounded by people just like me, and I was like, oh, there are lots of us. This is awesome. And I knew then that like I just could not care about anything else. Um, I could not pretend, I was like doing consulting to kind of pay some bills and bide my time. And I ended up, dropping all of that, spinning it down, and I did that in part so that I could not worry about, maintaining clients if I did decide to run my mouth on Twitter.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
I think I love the like orange pill moment, but I think for a lot of people, our understanding of things comes in waves and in layers. And so I have yet really to find like a super concise answer, but I think, it's okay because I think for other people too, like it takes time.
Mm.
I don't know. For me, like maybe I just have too much anxiety, but like I don't have a lot of like light bulb moments. I have these moments where like my brain just spins really, really fast. And, that will happen a few times. And then I'm really convicted about something.
Interesting. You talked about coming back from the Middle East and about like
Mhm.
your shock at what was happening in the US. I was actually living in the US at the time, so I kind of lived through it. I'm
Okay.
really
What years were you in the US?
2015 to 2021. So
Okay.
yeah, so I arrived at that. So I mean, I can give it to you from the British perspective that like
Yeah.
we didn't get any of these stories about Hillary Clinton, about the foundation, about Vince Foster. None of that stuff like permeated the kind of UK media at all. So I kind of came to the US and was just somewhat stunned that there was just this kind of aversion to Hillary, and I was like, this is obviously rooted in misogynism. Why would you, she's highly qualified, like she's already basically been part of the administration. Why on earth would they not vote her in? Like this is absolutely crazy, all the rest of it. When
Right.
Trump to me was a bit of a joke. I was just like, this guy is
Sure.
an idiot and he's like a womanizer and he's just, he's just this character that's on TV. And I
Right.
was so appalled that like my colleagues around me were voting him in. My boss at the time was a huge Trump supporter. I was like utterly disgusted. And I think it was like a day or two after Trump ended up in office. Like I was part of the protest on the streets of New York, which I think technically I was not allowed to do on my visa, like take part in political activity. But I was like, this is such a disgrace. I wasn't wearing a pussy hat,
Right.
but I was with people that were. I was
This is
like,
amazing.
this is like the worst thing that's happened. Yeah, I mean, I was stressed out and I was just like, and then, obviously there was this 4 years of like this media rampage when
Yeah.
I was like reading the media and this guy's a terrible person. And
Right.
then what happened for, I mean, I'm telling you my story because I'm sort of
No,
like,
yeah,
I'm
so
probably
what
like in
woke
the
you up from that? This is amazing.
well, and so at some point after like 4 years of like these very salacious stories, which I still to
Yeah.
this day wish were true, like the prostitutes urinating on the bed in Moscow and things, I was like, they were such great stories. I was like, if
Right.
please let this be true. But at some point, I was a bit kind of like, they've been throwing every resource they have at trying to convict this guy of all these different alleged things that he's done. And at some point, if they're unable to do that, you have to start to question whether any of these things are true. Because I was
Yeah.
like, how can they have all this resource to investigate him? He's been impeached and none of it sticks. And on the
Right.
one hand, you might say, oh, he's so powerful, he's so meshed with the deep state that they can't make anything stick. I mean, that's potentially one rational
Yeah.
response. But at some point I was like, this is ridiculous. And obviously we now know that all of this stuff was BS and
Right.
like, well, I say we, many people I guess still haven't kind of come around to it. But
It's true. Yeah.
and in reality, actually, his policies I liked a lot, like not
Hmm.
raging, not waging wars in the Middle East, like a
Right.
huge supporter of like anti-war stuff.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, so it was quite interesting. And then I think when Biden got elected, my hope was
Yeah.
just like, oh, could we just dial it down? We've had
Yeah.
like these lockdowns, we've had all of the cities in the US being burnt down with these protests. It's just like all of this crazy stuff. I was living in Jersey City at the time and I had a bug out
Okay.
bag ready because they were smashing up shops in Soho. And so we were like, oh, if we need to exit stage left really quick, like I had a friend
Right.
up in Connecticut who said you can just come and stay. If you need to leave at 5 minutes notice, just do it. I mean, people think that
Yeah.
this stuff wasn't real, but it was crazy at one point.
Yeah.
It really just felt like, the world was falling apart. So I thought, oh, great, Biden's
Yeah.
going to get elected. Didn't know anything about his background.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, he's really boring, dull. He'll be a great, boring administrator. This is
Right.
fantastic. World can go back to normal. And then we obviously know what happened after that. Things just got exponentially worse. And I
Hmm.
obviously now know all of the kid sniffing stuff and all of the other
Yeah.
things that have come to light that don't get put in the mainstream media very much, the stuff about
Right.
his daughter Ashley. But anyone that cares to look can find it, and
Right.
you know what kind of a character he is. Um, and obviously then in the midst of this, like all of the COVID stuff was going on, like the lockdown stuff, and I got into Bitcoin. So in retrospect now I look back
Mhm.
and I think, gosh, actually Trump's policies were quite good and I would agree
Yeah.
with most of them.
Right.
um and it was obviously just a really concerted attempt to get him to disrupt his time in office so that he couldn't get stuff done, and certainly so that he couldn't get reelected. But one
Yeah.
thing I'm quite curious about, and this is like, I wanted to ask you about this because you've been quite vocal, I think, in your support for him specifically in terms of his re-election. And obviously, he spoke recently at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville, which is
Hmm.
unprecedented to have an ex-US president talk about Bitcoin. I mean, I thought that that was
Right.
huge, no matter what
Yeah.
one thinks about Trump. But I'm
Right.
curious because you've also been very vocal about obviously lockdowns and all of the COVID policies of which he was partly
Hmm.
an architect. So, can you talk a little bit about? I'm interested to know when you came back to the US, what your impression was, and then that kind of journey and how you've got to where you are in terms of your support for him as a presidential candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. We had like opposite experiences. Um, and, if you'd have told me, well, I spent 12 years in DC, like adamantly against being involved in politics. I mean, literally on a first date, in DC, this is a very open thing. Like, do you have political aspirations? Because that's a whole life that you have to lead. And
Yeah.
I got to a point, I would say on a first date, like if you want to be a congressman or a senator or something, like it's not for me. I'm not well behaved. I don't like the cocktail parties. I'm not making small talk. And I was involved in the Tea Party movement there. Um,
Hmm.
Ironically, like not I was very not involved in Occupy, and then I ended up being involved in the Tea Party movement, and I think that was the first sort of like successful separation that, if you want to call it the deep state or whatever it is, achieved, because ultimately in retrospect, like the libertarians and the Tea Party movement really were mad about the same things and wanted the same things as the Occupy protesters wanted, but they successfully like created this divide. So anyway, yeah, so I fled DC, didn't want to be involved in politics, was very much like just live and let live, leave me alone. Um and I was abroad, when Trump announced that he was going to run, and then through that whole, so like I started traveling in like 2014, 2015. I was very spent very little time in the United States, and moved fully at the very end of 2015. So 2016, 17 I was gone. And so it was not necessarily like the amount of time that I was gone, but I think this period of time, where I was completely, and I wasn't like in Europe exposed to Western media. I was in the Middle East and I was in Asia, and I had really zero exposure to the craziness that surrounded all of that unfolded. And
In
I
terms
will
of like,
say,
I mean, you would have been
yeah,
quite familiar with Trump as a character there, being an American. What was your impression
yeah.
when you heard that he was running? Like, did it seem like a joke to you, or did you think, oh, he'd be great in office? Like, what was your take on that?
So I have a very unique perspective on this. I actually went to school with Eric Trump and I knew him
Ah,
quite well. He has always been a very, very like good friend to me, and like one of the best people that I knew. When I was in DC and I was partying, he would always, if he was around, he would make sure that I was safe because he does not drink, which a lot of people don't realize. Like Trump is sober because his brother was an alcoholic. Um, and the kids were always threatened with like, this was sort of the tabloid times. It wasn't necessarily a social media thing, but Trump always said, like, if you guys ever embarrass yourself on the cover of a tabloid, like, that's it. You'll be cut off. You'll lose your job. I will not support you. I wish that like fatherly, I think wish that would get more publicity. Like his kids are awesome and maybe they're brag or whatever. But
in
so
fairness,
I
I think
had
even Hillary Clinton said his kids were awesome.
yeah, they are, you know what I mean? So, I had met him, like he was at our graduation and I had met him a couple of times. And so it was always interesting, like having that unique perspective. To me, they were just a really genuine family. Like if you dig hard enough, you can find all these stories online about things that he did that never got any publicity, just like helped a guy with a flat tire. He paid somebody's house off. Like he's done all these things. And none of that was ever a surprise to me. Like while we were all like in college being degenerates, Eric was building a nonprofit to raise money for St. Jude's, which is a nonprofit here that raises money for kids with cancer. And I would say like a pivotal moment for me was when St. Jude's told him that they would no longer accept his money that he was raising for him. And I thought, what in the world has happened that a kid cannot raise money for kids with cancer? Like that is just unacceptable. And the other thing that happened was our alma mater actually started refusing Trump's money as well because they had some very high, big donors from the left that said like we don't want to be associated with him. So those are two things to me that really like have shaped my opinion, not just knowing them, but that kind of reaction from the public happening. Um and my opinion, there were always rumors when we were younger that his dad might run for president one day. So it just sort of like checked out to me. And he always said, the sort of line from them was that he never really wanted to do it, but that he would do it if he felt like, politics was such a disaster that he needed to go in and like help shape him up. He was revered for his like business skills. He had the reality show and everybody loved him. He was a great businessman. And so I think he saw the role as like a business role. Let's run the United States in a way that you would run a profitable company. And most people, if you look back, who worked for him were happy to work for him and for the Trump organization. And I think he gave too much credit to the government. He wanted it to all be like good. So I'm sorry, that's long-winded, but that informs
Your
it
perspective,
informed my
yeah.
journey. Yeah. And so then cut to like I'm abroad. He announces, I don't even know that any of this is happening. I'm not paying that much attention. But I do kind of keep like a vibe check on what the opinion is in the Middle East and in Asia. I was in, I think, Shanghai, and I was having dinner with, some colleagues, and someone said, like, oh, you guys must be so proud. Like, this businessman has given up his life to represent you. And I thought, that's pretty much how I feel, like as far as I know, he's a good guy, he has good kids, um, he's very successful, there's no reason that he has to do it. And so that was just sort of the beginning and end of my opinion of the whole thing, until 2018 when I came back. And obviously I knew that he'd won and I knew that like half the population was not happy about it, but I didn't understand the magnitude of it until I came back and was really like rebuffed for not hating him, right? So I
Mm,
had all these friends in DC, you know, a lot of my friends had gone to the protests the way that you did. And I don't publicly talk about like my personal relationship with them. Um, but it does, you know, it provides me like I think about
insight.
things differently. Yeah,
Mm,
and so I didn't like come in hot and be like, "Well, this is my friend's dad and you should like him," and da da da. But I did just come in and say, "Oh, so you're really mad that he won? Let's talk about that. Like, why?" You know what I mean? And I was just like quietly doing my little like research, and I just wanted to know, like, anecdotally, like, why are people so mad? I don't understand. Um, you know, I get it if you don't like him, but like, I don't know, half the country is always mad about the person that wins the presidency, right? Like, isn't this just a democracy? You know, I don't know. Um, and the way that I was treated for simply asking questions, uh, is what has like radicalized me to be this super pro Trump, like MAGA, please vote for him. I do see, you know, having just kind of not been propagandized on either side. Some people might look at it and say, well, you're obviously like radicalized, like pro Trump. But I just think, um, I think the election here now. So I'm sorry, there's a journey that happened there, right? Like people were literally telling me, like, how dare I question them? Like, because, you know, and I would say, like, I don't care if you like him or not. I'm just genuinely curious. Like, I was not here during the election. I don't know what happened. Like, did things happen that I'm unaware of? And I also like never really watched the media. I never trusted the media. Um, so I think during that time, also when I was like being really inquisitive, I also started to realize ultimately it was the media and the propaganda that was the problem because nobody had any actual uh like the stories were not true. You know what I mean? Nobody had any
yeah,
actual evidence.
it's really interesting actually, like what you're saying, because it's funny when I looked back on it in retrospect and I was like, why was that period when he was in office so stressful? And I
Yeah.
realized it was nothing to do with what was actually happening in the country. It was actually
Right.
100% the kind of rage that was generated on the legacy media
The
and
media.
obviously in social media as well.
Yeah.
And it was just all constant, amplified, amplified. And I think for me, that was quite, I didn't realize it at the time. And I think it's really only
Right.
post actually the whole COVID thing that I've realized
Uh-huh.
that because it was a very similar thing. I mean, I was a total branch Covidian when the whole
Yeah.
COVID thing happened. I was just like, we're all going to die. You know, like I was an early mask adopter. I was making masks when they weren't available to buy. I know, laugh.
No, no, I'm gonna tell you something.
No, but
Um,
I also think it's important to be honest about that because I don't
yeah,
want to kind of like whitewash history and sort of memory
right,
hold the whole thing. But you know, like I really bought into that. And then when I realized
right.
that all of this stuff was a lie, and when I sort of discovered that I'd been lied to and like the media was
Yeah,
making stuff up, it's quite a shocking journey when you go through
it
that
is.
because it kind of deconstructs everything you think that you've believed in. You know, I've grown up in this notion of like the press is there to speak truth to power and hold power
Right,
to account. And then when I kind of went back through, all of those happenings, and then you go back through all of the other stuff that's happened in the media, like the
right,
response to Trump's election and his time in office, you realize how much of your emotions and how much of your thinking is actually manufactured based on what you're seeing. And that's quite
yeah,
frightening because you suddenly realize how malleable you are as a human being, that if you're
right.
exposed to enough kind of group think about something and everything around you is screaming the same message, you actually don't sit there and break it down and think about it critically. You don't sit there and
Mhm.
think like, to your point, you came back and you asked people, what is it you don't like about him?
Yeah,
And I was thinking while you were saying that, I was like, what was it I didn't like about him? And I think for me, it was the fact that a woman had been denied a place as the America's first president, who I thought was
mhm,
highly qualified and should have been given that seat. And I thought that that was really disgusting. I didn't like his brash type of character and like his
sure.
morals. And I felt that he was being elected for me, what that did was it said something about the society that I was living in America, and the fact that people would elect somebody like that,
Yeah.
particularly the Christian contingent, who I was like, how can you guys support somebody who has openly cheated on his wife? He's got several divorces behind him, the whole pussy grabbing thing, which allegedly,
Yeah.
like, whatever. Um, all of that kind of stuff. And then there were all the rape accusations that I assumed were credible. I don't know,
Right.
actually, to this. I now question that, obviously.
Yeah.
But all of that kind of stuff, and I was just like, wow, this
Yeah.
is this is not just upsetting that he got elected, but the fact that
Right.
every people around me in my own office actually were architects of this. So that was kind of it. And I think
Yeah.
now in retrospect, I'm like, oh, a lot of that rage was really manufactured by the
It's so
media.
manufactured. Yeah. So I want to say something about that. And then I do want to address the COVID stuff.
Mm,
Um, but again, like a very waking up moment for me when I came back in 2018. I'll never forget. I was at a colleague's house and there was breaking news on CNN. And I literally about had a heart attack. I mean, for me, I'd not seen this since like 9/11. I mean, it was like 9/11 style coverage. And I like stopped the person next to me. I was like, what's happening? And they were completely unfazed, not even looking at the TV, like kind of like, what's happening with you? And I realized in that moment also how much of the rage and the craziness was being manufactured because everything was breaking news and the
mm,
24/7, news cycle and all this stuff. So I kind of like turned off the TV and just refused to watch it or any of that, which was a massive benefit. So I think manufactured really is the perfect word. But I wanted to, so I wanted to address the last piece of your question, which is about, Trump and COVID and how he led all of that. And I will say, I don't support any of it. Like, I did not get vaccinated. I'm in Florida. We did not lock down. I wasn't on Twitter at the time, but I was like, and I actually was pro mask for this short period of time when COVID came out in China. And like I'm on WeChat. I have friends and former colleagues that are in China. And all we really knew was that it was a viral infection. And presumably it was like kind of spreading. And so I was like, well, maybe we should wear masks. Maybe we should be alarmed, and people were like, you're a lunatic. Like, I always have been a little bit like of a germaphobe with OCD. And, so everybody like chalked it up to that, like, oh, here goes the germaphobe. And they're like, it's not coming here. Like, it's a thing in China. Um, but I got over that pretty quickly as I watched, it went from China to Italy to Canada. I was like, it's coming here, it's coming here. And I realized like, wow, this is it's a viral infection and it, not sure about the level of seriousness, as with many things. It really depends on like what's your base level of health. Like if you're a really healthy person, you might not get sick if you are exposed to a viral infection. And if you have a lot of other conditions and you're not healthy, you might be really susceptible, whether it's viral or bacteria. You get an infection, you get sick. Like that's how it works. Um, so, by the time it came here and everyone was like, oh, wear a mask, I was like, yeah, that does nothing for a viral infection. But I don't support the things that Trump did at all. But I will absolutely still vote for him. And I'll tell you why. I think first and foremost, we need to stop this nonsense where we think that like everyone needs to be perfect or align with us on everything in every way. I mean, obviously, like COVID is a huge example. And I know that, it's like a big thing. But like Trump's policies on COVID, like they didn't actually affect my life in any way. Like he rushed the vaccine and he did all those things. I believe that it was done in good faith and that he had bad advisement, which is its own conversation, but I don't believe that he was ill-intentioned with any of it. And he's also not the one that did any of the mandates. It was really
mm.
like here's a vaccine that's available for people that want or need it. And if it had been Biden that had done it, I mean, they'd be giving awards and celebrating and stuff. Um, but there were no mandates. And so people could do whatever they wanted, which is what I did. And so I find it difficult to say, like, well, because of that and that alone, I'm not going to vote for him in this time now, however many years later, where we have like actual communism on the ballot. I think what's happening is too serious to say, you know, that you're going to opt out. Like, I understand the apathy take from Bitcoiners. That's how I felt the whole time I was in DC. Like, I never voted, I never was involved, I didn't want to be involved, but I believe truly that that's how we got here. Um, I found out that something only like 10% of Americans normally vote. And it's like the crazy radicals that want to control your life that are going and voting. Um, and I think if everybody with common sense just made a little bit of effort to, you know,
Get politically
I
engaged.
hate, yeah, like I
Mhm.
absolutely, like, it's still like difficult for me to sit around and like advocate like, oh, please go vote. Like, I feel like such a hypocrite. And I've said this over and over on Twitter. Like, if you guys want to go literally burn the whole thing down, I will light the match, but you're not going to do it. We all know you're not going to do it, right? So we're going to have a president and we're going to have to follow the rules and regulations that they put in place. And if we're going to live under these structures, then like let's participate in choosing the person at the top. And also like down ballot too. Like a lot of that stuff affects our lives so much more than we realize, right? Like during
Mm.
COVID, if you were a government employee, the federal mandates might have mattered. But what really mattered was like, how did your school board decide about masks for the kids? Like, how does your local county deal with, like, can restaurants be open or not? Are there local mandates that say that there's a curfew or things like that? And so I think it's important to be involved in like choosing the people that make these decisions as well. Um, and I really just, when I look back at it, especially in retrospect, I think it's apathy that has gotten us here to the place where communism is literally on the ballot. And so apathy is not going to get us out of it. And it's not to say that Trump is going to come in and fix it all. I'm not hopeful of that, but it may give us 4 more years to build new tools from so more people can use Bitcoin, more tools for freedom, and then we might really, really need them. Um, so I
Why do you think,
understand.
I'm
Yeah,
curious, why do you think he's not recanted about the vaccine? I mean, knowing what we know now and the fact that apart from the like really dedicated branch Covidians, like everybody acknowledges that these vaccines are killing people and in insane numbers and causing, untold amounts of death and suffering. Like,
yeah,
and they're still mandated and they're still on vaccine schedules. But like, why do you think he's not come out and actually said that? I mean, is that I mean, I know this is speculation, but like, is
yeah,
it pride that he doesn't want to admit that he was kind of the architect of warp speed and got
right.
conned into kind of, supporting DARPA and their deployment of this? Or like, what do you think the reason is that he's
Well,
still?
I think there's definitely a little bit of ego. I mean, we've never seen him apologize for anything really, and it's not going to start now. He's like a 70-year-old man or something, right? But I think also, I said something about like once you realize Trump is like your boomer dad, you can't help but love him. And my dad, who is very much like me, I got all of my like hot spirit from him. Uh, you know, he I don't want to say that he like supports the COVID vaccines, but he kind of does. Like, he doesn't want to get into like conversations about how they might actually be killing people. I think it's a very hard, we touched several times on how difficult it is to admit that everything you thought your whole life was a lie, whether that's financial structures, global organizations not actually helping people. That's a really difficult thing to do, to say like this is all a lie. And I think, you know, uh, if you look at people in that age group, vaccines saved the lives of a lot of their loved ones. I mean, like when my dad was young, like the polio vaccine was just becoming available. Um, and I know that like there was someone very, very close to my father, who ended up with polio. And so he's a big advocate for like modern medicine. And I think it's a huge leap to turn around and say this is also all a scam, right? Like it comes back to like the difficulty of admitting that everything you think is a lie. And so I think, that's a super nuanced opinion, but I just genuinely believe that like Trump is coming from a similar place. The one thing that gives me hope is that he seems to have a very serious friendship with RFK. And I think there's a lot of hope in that. I mean, if the two of
Would
them
you
team
would
up,
you characterize it like that? Really? Would you characterize it as a friendship? Because I know they're very cordial, and I thought RFK was very. I was very pleased to see a few months ago when Trump was running that he, announced that he was running, that RFK was very respectful and saying, "Look, I'm not going to talk badly about him," blah blah blah. When somebody had sort of asked him a bit of a provocative question, but would you characterize it as a friendship?
yeah, I would. There was a little bit of audio that got leaked from a phone call that they had. And I don't know if people realize this, but that was like a 3-hour phone call. That was not like a cursory, like polite conversation. I mean, they were on the phone for like 3 hours. And then I don't know if you saw, I think just yesterday, um,
I
RFK's
did.
running mate. Yeah, like she's putting it out there that they might step back and team up with endorse Trump, which would be huge. So, yes, I absolutely would call it a friendship. Trump was friends with all of these people before he got into politics. If you look back at like some of the media clips or the articles that were in the media, you can kind of verify those friendships. And, it's a spectrum, of course, like some of it is politically expedient, but I do believe that they are friends. And I think that hopefully RFK is helping him along this journey to see like the medical. We talk about the military industrial complex, but there's also this medical industrial complex, and I hope that Trump gets there one day to realize um how much of that is a scam. But I guess I give it like grace and nuance to say like I know how my dad reacts when I have these conversations with him. And I just see so much of that in Trump. Like it takes time to realize like, okay, wow, like he understands with the media that it's all a lie. So the framework is there. But to apply that to entire new industries, I try and get all the time for my dad to get chicken at the farmer's market instead of the grocery store. Cause I'm like, Dad, it's full of hormones and it's genetically modified and it's sick chicken. It's gross. And he just rolls his eyes. He's like, oh, now all the food we eat is poison. Like,
And you're like,
I mean,
yes.
yes, it is. But it's a lot to accept. And I think sometimes there's willful ignorance where it's like, they're old and they don't want to deal with it. They're like, leave me alone. Let me go golfing.
I got to be honest, actually. I mean, like, I listened to about half of the conversation that Trump had with Elon Musk on X,
Uh-huh.
and the thing that because there were problems getting in because of that alleged DDoS attack and everything. But
Yeah.
what really struck me about it was it sounded to me like when you describe him as like a boomer dad, that was
Yeah.
exactly how it sounded. It was like the boomer dad with this sort of precocious, like clever child. Then they were
Yes.
sort of trying to have these conversations about things. And, I think at one point Musk made a comment about something like an NPC. And I was thinking, does Trump even know what an
No,
NPC
he
is?
doesn't. No, it's like you have to see it. Once you see it, it's like there's a clip right now going on going I guess somebody has just informed Trump how cocaine works. And
Oh,
it's
I saw that.
did you see that? Like it's adorable. And like I think people want to overanalyze it and be like, what is his narrative? What is his goal? What is his objective? No, he's just being honest. He has no idea. He never did drugs. His kids never did drugs, so he never had to deal with it. He has no clue. Like if I went to my dad and I said, do you know what it's like to be hopped up on cocaine? He would be like, "What?" Not like, my dad worked really hard. He worked his whole life. He's still like doesn't even think that weed should be legal. Like he's a total boomer. And I think Trump is really similar. Like he worked his whole life. He didn't do drugs. His kids didn't do drugs. He has no idea. And yeah, like cut him some slack, you know? He's just trying to like help. Like he's so honest. Like he can't be anything but completely honest, right? And so you just have to take it like at face value. Like, yeah, he kind of rambles on. I wish he was more succinct, but like I wish the same thing for myself. I ramble all the time and it's hard, you know? Like, but the annoyances are also the charms, you know? Like he's just going on and on because he cares so much. So like that should be the
Yeah.
takeaway.
I mean, I thought his talk at the Bitcoin conference was quite hilarious. It's just like all the sort of jokes that he makes and like the disparaging. And he is a stand-up comic, actually. Joe Rogan says that all the
Yeah,
time. He's a comic, but actually he is.
right.
When you
Yeah,
listen to how he kind of structures his like speeches, if you want to call it
right.
that. Yeah, they're very,
Yeah.
very comedic. Can I ask you as well quickly? Sorry, we're like
Mhm. That's
rabbling on here,
okay.
but
Yeah.
if you've got time, I'm curious about your thoughts about the assassination attempt on him.
Yeah. Well, I don't believe in coincidences at that level. You know, I don't believe that there were just a bunch of accidents that allowed for these circumstances to align. I think, you know, it's so I think it was, you know, at some level an inside job. I don't think, you know, a few people have asked me, do I think it was the Trump campaign itself? And I absolutely do not. I mean, what a close call. Like, no way. You know, he loves his life, he loves his kids. I don't think that he would take that level of risk. Um, but I
Oh,
think,
you mean like a false flag, right? Yeah, I had
yeah,
a
you
very
know,
lengthy discussion with somebody close to me about that who
yeah,
immediately thought that. And I was like, look, yes, I suppose you could have faked it, but
right,
as in like you could have faked it in that you could have said he didn't actually get shot, that he just,
right,
whatever. But I mean, that's possible. I don't know.
yeah,
But if it was an actual bullet, I'm like, there is no way that you would take the risk of not
right.
timing it right. Like, there's just no way.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, the way he moved his heads, you know, there's those recreations. Like, I mean, that was totally like you don't orchestrate something. I mean, we're talking
Mm.
like fractions of a second. Like that was not orchestrated. You know, I think by all intents and purposes, like the assassination, um, they didn't miss, right? He just happened to move his head at the very last second and it saved his life. Um, it makes me really, really sad that it's already been black holed by the media. It got, you know, no attention. They just swept it under the rug. And whether you love him or hate him or you're apathetic, I think it really deserves more like weight in the public discourse. It you know, it's already like old news, and that's heartbreaking to me.
Oh
You know,
God,
we
I
know
don't know.
all
Like I'm still like delving into all these podcasts where they talk about it. There was one with
yeah.
that ex military special forces Navy veteran or whatever, like Jason Posobiec.
Oh yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
I like
he was actually that was a shocking episode I listened to because he was actually breaking down all the steps and talking about what had happened and how it had happened and
right.
what what should usually happen at an event,
Yeah,
like how things like the security services didn't even turn up to the briefing on the morning of with the
I
local
know.
police, and he said that that is just completely like just there's no way that that would be an oversight. He's just like that should
Yeah,
never happen. And then obviously we've seen all these videos now of the police officers going like, I fucking I told them that,
right.
blah blah blah, so I mean it's just
It's
it's really
not
hard not to see that it is an inside job, but I mean like
yeah,
the weight of what that says of the stage that we've got to. And I was saying this 6 months
yeah,
ago. I was like, if they don't manage to indict him on these like 34 charges and all of that ridiculousness, which
yeah,
whether you like Trump or not, I mean that lawfare is obscene. But I
right.
was like, their next step is they're going to have to kill him. Like they're going to have to kill him because they're at
I
shit out of
know.
options. And then this happens, and I was like, yeah, there you go, boom.
Yeah, I work with actually my boss has been saying it for quite some time and even myself like I vowed during COVID to never say, you know, oh they'd never take it that far, but even for myself prior to the attempt, I was like, oh man, like I don't know. I just really didn't want to believe it, but lo and behold, here we are. And you know, the to the point, you know, that Jack Posobiec makes and that all this analysis is doing, which is all, of course, independent media because mainstream media, you know, won't give it an honest conversation. Um, but like, I mean, again, I'm in DC for 12 years. You go to a parade. there's not a roof that's not covered by counter snipers. You know, I worked not real far from the White House at one point. We had an office there, and you had to have a background check just to show up to the office. Um, you know, the measures that are taken are really just yeah, there's no way that it was an accident. And so, as you said, like the ramifications of that or the conclusions that we draw from that are pretty hard to process and stomach. But I just don't believe that it was, you know, an accident. I mean, there's no,
Yeah.
it's not possible.
Yeah, I don't think it was an accident. And I think the intent was to A, take him out of the race, and B,
Yeah,
to cause a civil war, because then that gives like, or civil war, to cause sufficient social unrest that it
yeah,
provided a pretext for other measures that they want to bring in, like CBDCs, like more
yeah.
social media monitoring. I mean, the stuff that's going on in the UK right now is just beyond
Oh my
insane.
gosh.
It's beyond insane. People being arrested for memes. I'm like, I don't even fucking
Right.
recognize that place anymore. It's just insane. Yeah.
It's terrifying. I just posted, I think yesterday, I said, if you guys let this come to the US, I'm just gonna wake up every morning and say, I told you so, and that's it. And it, you know, it's like I kind of say that in jest, but also not really. Like, wake up. People need to wake up because this is really happening and it's really close to coming to the United States. And then where do we go? Where do we go?
Goodbye.
Yeah, yeah,
Some
I tried
irony.
that, right? Like, it's funny because, you know, I'm like, why did I feel more free in Dubai? Like, I thought America was like the land of the free. And, you know, I've spoken about this as well and how that really shaped my, like, all these conclusions that I've come to. And it's true because Dubai is super safe. And, you know, look, you don't break the law in Dubai. You don't go there and do drugs or, you know, steal anything. But as long as you're not doing those things, like, it's super safe. And then, you know, and then people are like, oh, try and criticize the government. It's like, well, try and criticize the government in the UK or in the United States. Like, we're not that far away from, you know, at least in Dubai,
Mm.
they're honest about it. And I've always said that that's what I kind of started in the very beginning. My comparisons to China were at least they're honest about their censorship in China. You know, you turn on the TV and you know it's state propaganda. You open up the computer, you know it's all censored. And I think in the United States, it's basically the same, but we're just pretending that it's not, or they're
Yeah.
pretending that it's not. You know, I'm not
Yeah, kind
pretending
of
that, but
LARPing at freedom
yeah.
as opposed to it being really that way. Well, yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. Do you have any was oh, so actually I did ask a few people if they had questions to ask you. So I had one was more of a statement. I think it was from Mums for Bitcoin. She said, "Don't leave the country without letting
Oh,
me know," which I thought was very sweet. Like, take me with
she's
you.
awesome. I love her so much.
She's so sweet. Great kid as well. Like her son's
Hmm.
amazing.
I was gonna
And
say, talk about having great kids.
yeah, and I mean, she's doing it really against all odds as well. She's an incredible
Yeah,
woman. I interviewed her a few months back. I think it was after Bitcoin Miami last year. I met her.
yeah.
Greg was taking her around. Greg Foss, he'd sort of
Yes,
taken her under his wing.
that
Another
is how I
another
met
lovely
her as
guy. Like,
well. Hmm. Yeah, come back, False. We miss you.
oh, I know. He's such a great guy. He's really just such a kind-hearted individual. He's yeah, and he's connected so many people in the Bitcoin space. Like I don't think he even remembers or knows like some of the
I
things that
know.
he's kind of the driver of. The other person somebody asked actually, which actually I did think was quite an interesting thing to ask you, was like what your favorite movie is.
Probably Hackers, like the 1998 movie Hackers, because I was such a nerd. Like, it was like, oh, and there's a lot of movies I haven't seen. I'm like going back and watching them now because they don't make good movies anymore. But like when I'm choosing my gifts on Twitter and stuff, I'm just like randomly picking them. I don't know what any of them mean. I haven't seen like 90% of the movies that are out there. Um, but I grew up loving Sneakers, which really dates me. Like, if you look up Sneakers, you will believe how old I am. And then when Hackers came out, I was just like a total Hackers fangirl.
That's
So
funny. I thought you were going to say The Matrix. The Matrix is actually my favorite movie, and I remember watching it when, like, whenever it came out again, dating
yeah.
myself. But I remember watching it, and my first thought was like the bit when he's going through the office and there's all the cubicles and stuff, and he's like,
Uh-huh.
I forget the exact phrase, but he's like, "Oh, have you ever like felt something's not quite right?" And I was just sat in the cinema going, "Oh my God, yes, I've always felt like that. You mean I'm not
Right.
the only one?" And it was just such a moment of like, other people feel this way and they've actually made a
Mhm.
movie about it. So, yeah.
It's a good one. Also, V for Vendetta, which I
Mm.
only watched like during COVID or something. I had never seen it originally, but like talk about mind blowing, like the things that got predicted throughout that. I mean, that's wild. So,
Yeah, we live in a simulation.
yeah, we really do. I completely. And it's not only that we're in a simulation, but we're in like late stage simulation where they're just like flicking dials and punching buttons to see like what will we tolerate? Like how crazy can we make it?
How unbelievable can we make it until they all
Right.
realize they're in a simulation?
Right.
What level of crazy will they accept in clown world before they're like, yeah,
Yeah.
something's not quite right here?
Right.
Well, on that note, any words of advice for anyone listening about how to exit clown world and get on a Bitcoin standard?
Convert your fiat to Bitcoin and hold. Do nothing. It's the hardest thing to do is do nothing and then speak up. I meet people all the time and they're just like, thank you for saying what I feel like I can't say. And my number one response is say it. You don't have to say it like as loudly or as radically as I do, but just be honest. If everybody was honest about what they thought and felt, like they could not get away with half of what they're doing, 90% of what they're doing. So you can't be afraid to be honest about how you feel because, keeping our mouths shut is how we got here. And we're not going to fix it by keeping our mouths shut.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Definitely agree with that. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. It's
You're
been so
welcome.
great chatting to you. Like, thank you for
Yeah.
being so honest. And where can people find you on social media? Can you give your handles and where they should go and look you up?
Yeah, so I'm just on X, Twitter, X, nowhere else, and it's my name, Michelle Weekley, um, and that's
I
it.
should
I
say it
pay
is
for
spelt with a Ley at the end.
Ley, yes, 2 L's and then an Ley, but that's it. I have one profile, and that's the only place. So I am on Nostr, so I'm there as well. I'm not as active, but when I get canceled fully off of X, that's where I'll be. So
Yeah, I think a lot of people are not, but we're starting to realize actually like the importance of it. I put the newsletter out today and it was all basically about Nosta, just about how to
yeah,
get onboarded and what it does. So I think it will actually see a lot more adoption now. And I'm sort of sad that Elon hasn't actually just made Twitter a Nosta client, but I have a suspicion that
yeah,
his hand might be forced actually to do that. And if he did, he'd be super wise to do that actually. So I
right.
hope he does. We
I
shall
think so too.
see.
That'd be a really great uh
Step.
sorry, my brain. Yes.
Strategic move.
Integration was the word I was looking for. It'd be a great integration and I think, we'll see a lot of development there. So, but for now I'm just on X and you can find me there and, you know, if you don't like something I say, that's okay.
Yeah. If it-
It's okay. Like you don't have to agree with me on all the things. Like
No, I know. I mean, I don't know why people are so scared of debate as well. And I think when I was listening to the Bitcoin Veterans podcast, one of them made the
mhm,
very good point of saying you can actually just mute or block people if you don't. And I mute people all
yeah,
the time. I don't very often block them, but I mute like accounts all the time. Sometimes I mute accounts because they're just talking about something a lot that I'm not interested
right.
in and I want it off my feed.
Yeah,
So it's
me
just
too.
yeah, yeah.
No, my feed is like super heavily curated. I mean, I don't spend time on things I don't want to see because it shows you more of it. I just scroll past, I like mute, so yeah, you have to curate
Read and
your
be
own
aware.
feed.
Thank you so much again, Michelle. You've been amazing. And thank you
Great
for just
to
being
talk to
such
you.
a vocal voice and just being yourself, really, and being honest. Thank you. It's much
Thank you.
appreciated.
Well, thank you very much. I love what you're doing. I love you. It was great to talk to you. I'm glad we got to finally talk and keep up the great work.
Thank you.